We are going to be in Isaiah 36 tonight. Technically, Isaiah 36, 37 both, technically, and where we're going to be at. We finished up our study last week on the covenants, and for tonight, next couple of weeks anyway, we're going to kind of move our study in Isaiah from my sermon on Sunday night to BTC for the next few weeks anyway, especially as we look into this particular section of Isaiah. As you start this 36th chapter in the book of Isaiah, you get more into a section of narrative, is what it is. This section parallels some of the events recorded there in 2 Kings and in Chronicles as well, but it has to deal with parts of the reign of King Hezekiah. In particular, in the 36 and 37, we're dealing with the events surrounding one of the times that Syria came up and tried to besiege the city of Jerusalem. And then 37, 38, and 39 deal with a couple other events in the life of Hezekiah. As you begin to look at these chapters, 36 and 37 are actually chronologically before. Hold on, get my word backwards here. 36 and 37, this particular siege actually occurs after the events of 38 and 39. But they're put before it because, well, it serves the purpose of the book of Isaiah. Because here you're seeing the end of the kind of the Assyria section as now you move into the threat of Babylon in the next several chapters of the book of Isaiah. But nonetheless, as you begin to look in these chapters, we're going to see some pretty amazing things that God does. But more importantly, you see the responses that Hezekiah makes. Hezekiah is one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had. Hezekiah was really third line. I think of David, Solomon, and then Hezekiah is probably right there after that one. There are 11 chapters devoted to him in 2 Kings 18 through 20, 2 Chronicles 29 to 32, and then of course these sections here in Isaiah from 36 to 39. So Isaiah is one of the most mentioned, most spoke of, and really he did a great many things in that were very good in the work of the Lord. And beginning there in chapter 36 of Isaiah, it records, it says, that it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them. And the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. And then came forth unto him Eliakim, Hilkiah's son, which was over the house, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah, Asaph's son, the recorder. We'll pause right there for just a moment. First of all, in these verses, you are introduced to kind of your main characters, so to speak, for the next several chapters. First of all, of course, is King Hezekiah. This is the 14th year of his reign. The book of Kings, speaking about Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18 says that he came to reign in the third year of King Hosea, the king of Israel. It says he was 25 years old, 18 and 2, when he began to reign. He reigned 20 and 9 years in Jerusalem. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, 18 and 3, according to all that David and his father had did. He removed the high places, broke the images, cut down the groves, and broke in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made for under those days. The children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he called it Neston. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, or any that were before him. He claimed to the Lord, departed not from following him, and kept his commandments which the Lord commanded Moses. The Lord was with him, and he prospered with whithersoever he went forth, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not. And so Hezekiah was a very good king, not merely because he did physical reforms, but really also because of his spiritual reforms. He His father was prone to idolatry, but yet he reformed that. He went in and he started taking out a great many of the idols that were there, really leading a great spiritual revival. Apparently, even the long-standing idols. Moses, he took that brazen serpent in the wilderness that, you look unto it and you were healed, and bit by a snake, you look to the serpent, and trusted that God heal you and you're healed. Well, they kept that, and apparently by the days of Hezekiah, that had become an altar. The Jews like to make everything idols, I guess, and so they had been using it for an idol. They burned incense unto it. Well, that's foolishness for many reasons. First of all, God said not to worship idols, and second of all, they should have remembered that wasn't serving that healed anybody. It was God who did the healing. That was just what they had looked to in faith. Picturing the Messiah, obviously we know, look and live. Look to Christ and find salvation. Just as Moses led up the serpent wilderness, even so Christ is going to be lifted up, speaking of Calvary, all that was. But Hezekiah did all these reforms. He was willing to do what God commanded. He started removing idols and idolatry. And, he was making great spiritual progress. He was leading even in redoing some of the feast days they hadn't done in quite a while. He was doing it. And of course, according to Kings, God was blessing him for it. Hezekiah was doing what he was supposed to. God did what he said he would do when he did what you're supposed to. He blessed it. And Israel prospered, he prospered in as well. And so as you begin looking at these chapters, looking at this, understand that from an Israeli standpoint, you are looking at a time of prosperity. Okay, this is a good time. It's a good king. Okay, yes, he made his mistakes. We'll get to that a little bit later. But he was a good king, and they had good times because of it. Okay, bad things don't always happen at bad times. Sometimes it's when things seemingly go right that things just go bad. Hezekiah, here he is doing spiritual reforms. He's leading, really striving to do the best that he can do. And yet now he is confronted with seemingly really impending doom, if you want to call it that, because Assyria was doing what Assyria did. They were marching through. They were conquering nations and city-states left and right. They had just conquered the northern kingdom of Assyria, and Israel rather, and now they were standing at the doorsteps, literally, of Jerusalem, preparing to lay siege to it and to conquer it. And that's where these men come from. The king of Assyria, which the next guy I see there is Sennacherib. He is dispatched to come and to speak to Hezekiah, which actually, if you look in the king's account of this, there actually was 3 men that were dispatched. They don't actually have their names or given their titles. That word there, Rabshak, is not actually the man's name. It was his military office. It was his title. There were 3 of them. There is Tartan, there is Rabasarius, and Rabashak. Those were actually ranks. They were titles. You had basically your supreme commander, your chief officer, and then your field commander, which is basically what Rabashak was. He was the field commander. And so basically the king of Assyria sent his 3 high-up generals. Okay? He didn't just send some ministry officers. He sent higher-up individuals. This was not an effort to do peace treaties. Keep that in mind. This wasn't just like, well, hey, let's go see if we can come to peace. This was either you're going to surrender or we're going to kill you and take over the one anyway. And that was the gist of how this conversation was supposed to go through this. And so Sennacherib sends his generals, his officers, to speak with him, to speak with Hezekiah and the nation, and he wants them to essentially surrender, to again pay tribute. Now, in verse 2, it says that they came from Lachish to Jerusalem, the king Hezekiah of the great army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. Now, the interesting thing about that is that if you were to back up in the book of Isaiah in chapter 7, Isaiah actually goes and he meets with King Ahaz and he rebukes him for the alliance that Ahaz had made with Assyria. And he did that in, of all places, 7:3, it says he was in the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. And so, at the same place that Isaiah had rebuked Ahaz and said, look, you don't need to lie on Syria. This is not what you do. Trust in me. It's where your faith has come from. And now in the exact same place where Isaiah rebuked him for it, Isaiah's prophecy now comes to pass, basically, because now Assyria is standing in this essentially same spot, and they are demanding the downfall. They're demanding the surrender of the nation of Israel. They're wanting Judah to surrender. They're wanting Jerusalem to surrender. That's where they come to. Of course, Hezekiah, verse 3, sends his 3 ambassadors as well. Syria sent 3 generals, and so Hezekiah sent his 3, Eliakim, Shebna, and then Joah as well. And so you've got 3 generals, and then you've got a man of the house, you've got a scribe, and you've got a recorder. In some ways, you kind of think that's unfair trading in some perspectives, because on the one side you've got military generals, a marching army. On the other side you've got a scribe, and you've got a recorder. But Isaiah and Hezekiah knew what he was doing. They went for a specific purpose. They went representing him. But when you get to verse 4, we start looking at this appeal that Rabshakeh makes unto them. What you find beginning in verse 4 is probably one of the most outright blasphemous and most ridiculing speeches you're going to find anywhere in the Word of God. This man, he was a general for a reason, and quite frankly, if you look at what he's saying here, he knows how to talk. That's one thing you give him. He knew how to talk. He knew how to phrase things. And I'm sure that in some locations there are nations that he probably convinced by the word of his mouth. When you can speak good, you've got a couple 100,000 people standing behind you that are ready to do whatever you say. Some people go do pretty much whatever you say, and no matter what or how bad it is. But this man knew what he was speaking of, and this is the great threat. Here you have Israel, who's seemingly doing well, and now you've got this army, this large army with these 3 generals who are coming to speak to you because they want your complete, total surrender and surrendering unto them. They've already destroyed your sister nation up north, and now they want your submission as well. As a child of God, it does always seem like sometimes things are going the greatest, sometimes the darkest hour just seem to come up there. That was just the world that Hezekiah and them lived in. They lived in tumultuous times because it seemed like every couple of decades or so there was some kind of shift in world power. And Israel just happened to be in the middle of in a little geographic location where the world powers that beat for power generally at some point in time ended up coming through Israel. But Israel was necessarily the biggest nation, but because they were the bridge. If Babylon wanted to go to Egypt, they went through Israel. If Egypt wanted to go up, they had to go through Israel. It was the fastest and the best way to go through. When you didn't go through the desert, that was a bad idea. And so here they were again in seeming peril. But yet, one thing that stands out as we go through here is that this is not the first time, and it will not be the last time that Israel, Judah, has been, besieged or under the attack of some enemy nation. You look at the book of Judges, and the whole book of Judges is nothing but foreign powers oppressing Israel, and Israel battling back after God calls up a leader. You would think that Israel would be able to recognize some things and would know, hey, we've been in this boat before, we'll know what to do. Many times they didn't. But we're actually going to find here that this time, because Hezekiah was a godly man, and because his nation was in a good position, that they actually did the right thing here. In our verse, before we get to that, listen to the words of this general as he speaks. He tells them in verse 4, he says, go tell Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein thou trust? I say, sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now, on whom do you trust, that you rebel against me? Though thou trust in the staff of his broken reed on Egypt, or if man lean, it will go in his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt, to all that trust in him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and said to Judah and Jerusalem, you will worship before this altar? Now therefore give pledges, I pray thee, to my master, the king of Assyria, and I'll give thee 2,000 horses. If you will, thou be able on thy part to get riders, set riders upon them, how then wilt thou turn away the face of one captain, the least of my master's servants, and put thy trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? And am I now come up without the Lord against this land to destroy it? The Lord said unto me, go up against this land and destroy it. Now, first of all, as we begin looking at some of the words there, one of the key things, if you notice it here, is that important phrase. You see it there in verse 5, or in verse 4, you see it in verse 5, you see it in verse 6. That is, in whom do you trust? What confidence is this wherein thou trustest? He said in verse 4. If you look back on the last several chapters of Isaiah, what was one thing that Isaiah kept getting on Israel for? They trusted in Egypt. They trusted in Assyria at one point in time. That Israel is always trusting in someone or something other than the Lord. And here, these chapters kind of surmise some of that, because the king said, who do you trust in? You know, as a child of God, that's kind of an important question that you'd better figure out early on in your life. You better get a grip on. You know, who do we trust in? You know, for this man was standing here, and he was actually making a valid point. There was truth here in some ways. Because who were they going to trust in? What confidence did they have? In his mind's eye, they had nothing to trust in, and they had absolutely no reason for any type of confidence. Because he goes through and he breaks down several of their arguments. You know, he says in verse 5, he said, I have counseled of war, whom you trusted, you rebel against me. He mentions Egypt, verses 6, and how about you trusting in Egypt to come to your rescue? Well, they're nothing but a reed. You trust it, and it's going to break, and it's going to go through your hand. Which, if you trust in a dry reed, and that where you put your weight up on it, and it snaps, that thing's going to come back and go straight through your hand. So Egypt's nothing. They have no power. In other words, he said, what foreign power do you have? Every nation's fallen before us. Egypt is nothing. We're going to conquer them too. You think you can trust in men to deliver you from my hand? You are sadly mistaken. When we as God's people put our trust in men and in the things of this world, we are going to be sadly disappointed because God's the one we need to trust in. In the darkest hours, men are not who we need to trust in. Because men are oftentimes, even if they don't mean to be, often fail us. We need to learn to trust in God first. God will give us the help that we need. He might use men. He might use other things. But we need to trust in God. Because men are often short-sighted. This man here, speaking to Israel, he's warned. They said you can't trust Egypt. You know, you have to imagine that, you know, as you see a little bit later in our verses, the people in the city could hear what they were saying. You know, you got to imagine there are people in that city who were probably thinking to themselves, boy, we're going to worry about it. They're here, boy, Egypt's going to come to our rescue. You know, we're going to have powers come in. They're going to defeat these armies. We're going to be okay. And he just told them that ain't going to work. That he is not going to save you. Then he went beyond that. And not only did he say that human powers couldn't help, then he starts rebuking God. He actually starts getting on to God. He said in verse 7, well, we trust in the Lord our God. That's what it should say. He said, look, you say you don't trust in Egypt because you trust in God. Well, what's your God going to do? He said, what God is that? You mean the one that Hezekiah done destroyed all the altars to? Now, there's two sides to this. From his perspective, I mean, general perspective, all that he knew was that King Hezekiah had gone through and had taken down all these altars, all these high places throughout all the land because they weren't supposed to be there. Remember, okay, where did God say they could worship? In Jerusalem. Okay, it didn't matter if you're worshiping God. If you had an altar in Dan, if you had it at your house somewhere in the middle of the desert, God said that wasn't accepted. They're only supposed to offer sacrifices there in Jerusalem at the temple. And so this man, obviously, he didn't care about what God said. He just knew what he had known. He knew that Hezekiah tore all this down. He said, you really think that God's going to protect you? Well, Hezekiah has done tore down all his altars. What kind of trust are you going to have in him? I mean, Hezekiah has done made God bad. He tore down all of his altars. And told them they had to go back and worship at Jerusalem. Hezekiah did right. But again, put yourself in the mind of the Jews looking at this massive army before them. Again, you have to think that there are some that probably began to get a little bit scared because they didn't know. They don't understand all the law. But yet this man is speaking words that are truly frightening in some ways because they realize this man literally could do what they wanted. And you got to love verse 8 and verse 9 because now he says, well, what kind of army you got? He basically tells them, we'll give you horses. He said, you think you got men that can fight against us? We'll give you the horses. We'll give you the horses. We'll give you all the war machines you want. You still won't be able to defeat us. He's attacked everything they've got. Foreign powers, God themselves. He says, there's nothing you can do that can defeat me, that can overcome me. And then he went even farther than that in verse 10, because then he said, and I've now come up. He said, verse 6, and am I now come up without the Lord against this land to destroy it? The Lord said to me, get up, go up against this land and destroy it. Now he tells them, he said, look, you can't trust in Egypt. You can't trust in your God. And you can't trust in yourself. And you know what? Your God is the one who sent me. Now that's just outright blasphemous accusation. That's some pretty bold defiance on his part. But, and there was probably a measure of truth to that because God did bring him up here to judge it. But that's not what he had in mind. He was just proving to them a point. He said, could he really come there if God didn't want it? He's playing mind games. This is what we call psychological warfare. He's doing his best to convince someone somewhere in that city that he was right. Keep in mind, from a warfare standpoint, you didn't have to convince anybody. All you got to do is convince the one person that could go in and convince the king or get rid of the king and then take over and surrender everything. He's playing against all their arguments. Who are you going to trust in? He did his best to deny, to refute, to undo every element of trust they had. He wants them to be broken. He wants them to surrender. As a child of God today, remember the world will always want you to give up, to surrender to whatever forces of sin may be beckoning to you, whatever temptations you're facing. God wants you to surrender. The world wants you to surrender to it, to give you and stop serving the Lord. God doesn't want that. We need to learn to trust in the Lord. Then you get into verse 11. And now the people of Hezekiah had sinned, begin to speak. He says, I pray thee unto your servants in the Syrian language. We'll understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language, in the ears of the people that are on the wall. Harashik said, hath my master sent me to your master, and to thee to speak these words? Has he not sent me to the men that sit upon the wall, that they may eat their own dung and drink their own piss with you? Then Rabashak stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language, and said, hear ye the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, let not Hezekiah deceive you, for you will not be able to deliver. He will not be able to deliver thee. Hezekiah will make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord God will surely deliver us. This city will not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria. Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me, buy a present, and come out to me, and eat ye every one of his vine, every one of his fig tree, and drink ye every one the water's own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of corn and wine, and a land of bread and vineyards. Beware, lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arphad? Where are the gods of Shiphrasam? And have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who are they among all the gods of these lands that they have delivered their land out of my hand? That the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand. But they held their peace, answered him not a word. For the king's commandment was, saying, answer him not. This is where you understand a little more. The three men that Hezekiah said, he told Rabashak, he said, just speak to us in your language, because we understand it, and don't speak in Hebrew, because we don't want anybody behind us understanding what you are saying. They knew what he was doing, and he knew what they were doing. And he just went right around them, and he then got even louder to make sure everybody could hear him, and start speaking in Hebrew. And now he tells them they don't even need to trust in the words of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was a godly king. He had proven himself to those who cared enough to pay attention to him. And yet, now he said, don't trust him. He's not going to be able to save you. He can't deliver you. He keeps telling you that God's going to save your village, that God's going to save this city and this nation. But he's wrong, because we are going to be victorious. And you don't need to trust in him. Basically told him, look, I'm not speaking to you. I'll speak to anybody that wants it. He said, all it takes is one person. Go in there, assassinate the king, get rid of him, and let us come in and have our way, and we'll all be fine, and you'll all be just perfectly peaceful. You just somebody step up and save some lives. I really, if they would have done that, it still wouldn't have been peace for them. But that's not what he wants to mention. This man has spoken against God. He's spoken against God's anointed, that being the king, because Hezekiah was God's anointed. He was the king of Israel. He has spoken against God's people. And he has made all of these great accusations. And he has said that God could no longer deliver Israel, and all the gods and all the other nations could deliver their people from him. And now the three men in verse 22, they did the one thing that was right. It says they came to Hezekiah with their clothes rent, verse 22, and told him the words of these men, and knew what they said. They knew their condition. They rent their clothes. They were distraught. They were worried, and they were concerned about these things. And Hezekiah agreed with them. You notice in verse 37, verse 1, because it says that when he heard it, he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. Now, as you get to look into 37, you begin to understand the way that Isaiah, the way that Hezekiah, the way that we today ought to respond to these types of situations. These men did right, and really Hezekiah did right. This was a distressing situation. This was a perplexing time for them. There's nothing wrong with getting upset, and nothing wrong with at times being distraught for situations. We are people. We have emotions. God knows that. The problem isn't always the emotions we have. It's what we do with it that become the issues. These men were grieved. They were upset. They were genuinely concerned. But they did what they were supposed to do. They went to the king. And that's what Hezekiah did. He was also upset. He was concerned about these things. And he did one thing that many kings in Israel never did, that always caused problems. He went straight, it says, into the house of the Lord. He went in and he prayed. He went in and he saw the Lord's counsel. He went into the house of the Lord. And then it says in verse 2, he sent Eliakim, the elders of the priests, covered sackcloth to Isaiah, to the prophet. And the message that said in verse 3 said, "This day is the day of trouble, of rebuke and of blasphemy, for the children are come to the birth, and there is not strength to bring forth. And may be the Lord thy God will hear the words of Rabshakeh, the king of Syria's master, has sent to reproach the living God, and will approve the words that the Lord your God has heard. Wherefore lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left." So the servants of the king Hezekiah came to Isaiah. Isaiah said unto them, "Thus shall you say to your master, Thus says the Lord, be not afraid of the words that you have heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him. He will hear a rumor, and will return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." And so this was their initial response. Rabshakeh has made his appeal. He has stated Israel where they stand, which in his eye was right for picking and plunder. And now God's people have heard. They have become distressed, but now they have done what they're supposed to do. They have took it to the house of the Lord. Then they took it and found Isaiah, who was the prophet spoke from God, and told him about it. Now Isaiah has returned with the same response. He has answered them. And God told them that he was going to send a blast upon them. He'd hear a rumor, and he'd return unto his own land. And so God's already addressing this particular situation. You know, as you consider some of the more perplexing situations that we come to in life, and When you look at some of the darker hours, those moments where we sit there, we think, all hope is lost, there's nothing we can do. We've done, physically, but metaphorically, rent our clothes and laying there in sackcloth and ashes and just bewildered as, Lord, I don't know what we're going to do. All hope is lost. We need to remember that all hope isn't lost. It may not be seen, but that doesn't mean it's lost. Sometimes hope is always there. Sometimes it's just hidden behind the clouds and you can't see it. We need to learn to trust. If we're trusting in men, we're trusting in people around us, we will oftentimes be discouraged or may even fail. But when we put our trust first and foremost in God, that's where we find our great successes. We need to learn, much like Hezekiah did here, that in times of great distress, we need to go to the Lord first. As soon as he heard this problem, he took it to the Lord. As soon as Peter looked around and he saw his way, he started to sink, he reached out for the master's hand and took it and picked him up. Sometimes even in the greatest moments of faith, Peter was walking on water, for goodness sake. That's a pretty remarkable thing of faith that Peter did. But when he took his eyes off the Lord and he started to sink, he reached out and the Lord picked him up back up into the water once again. Sometimes all of us can suffer times of doubt and uncertainty, times when our faith may begin to dissipate a little bit. But we need to learn that we need to flee to the Lord, run to the house of the Lord, go to God and trust in Him, just like Hezekiah did here. And go to the man of God, seek God's counsel, and trust Him. God has a plan. God's never blindsided. God's never taken off base. God knew Assyria was at Jerusalem's door before Hezekiah did. And God knew exactly what He was going to do and how He was going to do it. So He went to the prophet and found his comfort and found his solace there. And as we'll look next week at the latter part of this chapter, we're going to see that he even finds even more encouragement. We actually come to one of the more powerful prayers that Hezekiah gives there in the middle part of the chapter. That even shows even more the faith that we should have in these times, and how much that the world can't do anything unless God permits them the ability to do so. In the end, God's the one that's in control of all things. Any questions or comments or anything about the 36 and the first part of 37?
It's kind of like Nebuchadnezzar was this morning.
Yeah.
I'm king, and can't nobody do nothing to me. Mm-hmm. He showed Nebuchadnezzar, and he'll show Sennacherib also.
Yep. It's that story. Really, when you look at it, it's sad. It's irony in some ways, because his men rebuked God directly, and in the inner part of 37, you find out that he ended up dying at the very altar of his God. And then whose God here failed who? But men can make all the boasts they want to, but in the end, the boasts of men are just that. They're empty words. God's only going to let you do what He wants. Yeah, Assyria conquered Israel, but you know what? God permitted them to. They could have conquered Judah if God wanted them to, but God didn't want them to. Their time wasn't done. Largely because of men like Hezekiah, who had enough faith to lead Israel in these revivals that kept them alive and going for as long as they did. They had some pretty rough years, and there were some pretty bad kings. They had enough good years to keep them going past the northern kingdom. Anything else? All right. Well, I conclude BTC for tonight.